Let's talk about why first books are never our best. And I'm so excited today to be talking with Meg from iWriterly. Meg is an amazing human being and a really good friend here in the Authortube community who you should definitely be following if you aren't already. And I was just hoping to let her introduce herself really quick.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. For those of you who don't know, my name is Meg Latour. I'm the host of the YouTube channel iWriterly, where we create videos about how to be a successful modern day author. I'm also a science fiction and fantasy writer, developmental book editor, and former literary agent. And thank you again for having me. It's great to chat with you and laugh at everything.
Oh my gosh, yes. We're laughing a lot. We are so excited to talk about all the firsts in general. And so in this particular video, we're talking about like your very first book, whether it's your debut that you're publishing or your first book that you're ever writing. And then on Meg's channel, we also talked about how first drafts suck. So if you want to enjoy that and all the goodness that comes with commiserating about first drafts in general, make sure that you head over to Meg's channel, and I will link that below in the description box so you can go watch it there after this video. But today, let's start with why your first book, your very first, most precious baby, probably isn't your best. There's a saying that I heard somewhere, and I will just pretend that I said it, even though it wasn't original with me, but the first book is your first pancake. And whoever said that originally is a genius, because you just picture your first pancake that you make in the morning. It tends to be a little wonky, a little out there. You can still eat it. There's nothing like super wrong with it, but it's not your best work. And I think that applies to books in your first book, because you have to write that first book and learn and grow as an author, but each book that you write will make you a better writer. And I don't know how else to say this. It's just not going to be your best work. So we wanted to talk about that today. Meg and I are going to go back and forth. We kind of chatted and thought of a lot of different things that we could say. So we're just going to kind of do talking points and go back and forth in this video. All right, so the first talking point is something that we talked a lot about in the video that Meg and I did on first drafts, and it's going to be just 10 times more true for your first book in general. All those weaknesses that we talked about for first drafts are going to be massively apparent in your very first book. Because as you are growing as a writer, you're going to obviously build on your strengths, and you're going to correct all those weaknesses, and you're going to become more and more aware of them over time. You're going to very easily recognize the things that you shouldn't do as time goes on. But when you're writing your very first book, some things are just going to go right over your head, and you're not going to even realize that you're doing it. So you're going to have to go watch Meg's video to learn more details on what those are.
I will say that critique partners and beta readers are invaluable, because as new writers, or maybe your first couple of books, you're not entirely aware of your weaknesses as a writer, and that's where your buds will come in and tell you what's wrong with your book, and you need them. Let's move to discussion point number 2, which is traditional publishing takes a long time. This obviously will not apply to everyone. If you want to self-publish, this is not going to apply to you, but I think it's important to note that for anyone who wants to pursue traditional publishing, you will know it takes a million years to publish a book traditionally. Therefore, you may have written many more books by the time your first one hits the bookshelves and is published. For those of you who may not be aware, traditional publishing is where writers query literary agents and eventually maybe secure representation, and then their agent will pitch their book on their behalf to editors at publishing houses. If you guys see my eyes bopping up and down, it's because I'm referencing my notes while we're chatting. But if an editor purchases a book while on submission, the author will then sign certain rights away, and the book will be published at no cost to the author. So I just want to caution that there are these things called vanity presses, but legit publishers never charge an author money to publish their book. But the publisher will take care of everything on behalf of the writer and do all the creative decisions, such as work with cover designers. But the author's primary job is to work with in-house editors to edit a book and prepare it for publication. After that's done, the author is then expected to participate in the marketing efforts, etc., and so on. Now, the average timeline for all of this is years. Let's say an author writes a book, and for simplicity's sake, we're going to say it took the author 1 year to write a book. Then they have to send query letters to literary agents and hope to secure representation. That process can take many years, but let's pretend for the simplicity it's 6 months to get an agent. So 1 year to write a book, 6 months to get a literary agent. Once you have an agent, if they're an editorial agent, you might spend 3 months working with the agent editing your book prior to going on submission. Once you're on submission, that can take 6 months to a year, longer. And if your book gets picked up by editors at publishing houses, and it might not, you might go through all of this and still might not get picked up by an editor at a publishing house, and then you have an average publishing timeline of 2 years. And I'm saying all this for a reason, so hang in there with me, guys, we're almost there. So 1 year to write a book, 6 months to get an agent, 3 months of editing a book if you have an editorial agent, 1 year on submission, 2 years after your book has been acquired by an editor at a publishing house. That is almost 5 years between the time you started writing a book and then the time that your book is published. 5 years is a long, long time for a writer to learn their skill and their craft. So all that to say, the first book is never going to be your best, because a lot of times you've changed so much in that time, because you've probably been working on other books and other projects in that time, and you're not the same writer that wrote that book 5 years ago.
I did not know it was that long sometimes. That's intense. Yeah. I will say, even from the indie side, like, I don't know, everybody's so different in the indie world, but even if you were one of the fastest, I could still say that most likely you would feel like you've grown. Like if it's a year between that first draft and then when it's published or whatever it might be, even that is enough time for you to look back and go, oh my gosh, what did I do? It's a frustrating place. And we're going to talk about this more, but it's just a frustrating place to have more awareness than you used to have, if that makes sense.
Few other things to add to this particular point are the first books reflect you as the writer at that time. So if we're constantly improving our craft, which we should, that first book will never be our best. It is the best that we can do at that time, and that is nothing to be ashamed of.
100% agree. And our next talking point is basically along those same lines. The more books you write, the better the books will get. And so like Meg said, if you know that you're getting better, then you also know by logic that the first book is not as good. Like there's no shade being thrown if you're like, yeah, my upcoming books are better, because that's actually a good thing. You're growing as a writer. It can be hard to look back on your first book. At least for me personally, it can be hard to look back and see the things that you weren't aware of. But it's one of those first book things. This again is just more of a venting video than actually resolving anything, to let you know it's okay if your first book isn't your best, but as long as it was your best at that time. That's what's important.
I want to add, for all the aspiring writers who are potentially watching this video, I have not published a book yet. So for me, when I think of like my first ever book that I've completed, edited, and I've queried, that guys was not really good, and it's okay. It's the first book that you've ever written, and so I think this discussion should apply to kind of everyone. If you've completed, edited multiple manuscripts, it's that first book that you go, ooh, and you're like, well, I guess I'm gonna get better, and thank goodness for that.
Yes. And can I side tangent us? This is not in our notes, guys, but I just want to hear Meg's opinion on just this weird idea that I've had lately, where have you ever seen an author who's like, I should have just not queried my first book, and anybody who's like, I just should have moved on to book 2 and like called that first book practice? Or do you like, how do you feel about that? Because I've heard people go both ways.
Yeah, I think I'm a very nice example of that question. So I think in general, writers, I don't know where the statistics comes from, but everyone says it, and I've heard it from literary agents, industry pros, but most writers who want to be traditionally published write an average of 4 books prior to getting a literary agent, and we have all those steps that we described before. So that means you do at some point have to put a project behind you if you're querying it and no one's picking it up. And a lot of people say, oh, I queried 200 literary agents before I got my person, and then I got a book deal, and that's fabulous. But I don't have 200 literary agents that I want to query. So I think if you kind of query your first 30, 50 agents that you want to work with, and no one picks it up, then you have to put the manuscript aside. You can definitely try to rewrite it, and agents will look at it a second time, the same manuscript. If you completely rewrite it and do some big revisions to it, But I think for me, when I wrote my very first story, it was a portal fantasy. It was a young adult. I wanted it to be an adult. It was definitely young adult, or a portal fantasy. And then I rewrote it 3 or 4 different times. And I mean complete rewrites where I changed the genre, I changed the setting, I changed the characters, I changed the plot. And then I realized that I grew as a writer and I had outgrown that particular story idea and I just had to move on. And sometimes you just have to do that because sometimes your ideas are holding you back because you've grown as a writer and that story idea is a nice idea in your head, but it just can't be conveyed as a book because maybe it's not a good enough story to actually make a book about. My 2 cents.
No, that's good. I really wanted to know that because, yeah, I just feel like sometimes we get so attached and it's really hard to know when to let go. So that's a really cool, like, measuring stick to kind of like go with other people's feedback. That's really wise.
Let's move to our 4th topic, which is ambition versus experience. And let's start things off by reading a quote from Ira Glass. Nobody tells this to people who are beginners. I wish someone told me. All of us who do creative work, we get into it because we have good taste. But there's this gap. For the first couple of years you make stuff, it's just not that good. It's trying to be good. It has potential, but it's not. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, is still killer. And your taste is why your work disappoints you. A lot of people never get past this phase. They quit. Most people I know who do interesting creative work went through years of this. We know our work doesn't have this special thing that we want it to have. We all go through this. And if you're starting out or you are still in this phase, you gotta know it's normal, and the most important thing you can do is do a lot of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week you will finish 1 story. It is only by going through a volume of work that you will close that gap and your work will be as good as your ambitions. And I took longer to figure that out, to do this, than anyone I've ever met. It's gonna take a while. It's normal to take a while. You just got to fight your way through. Whew. The short of it is, you kind of have to write those first 4 books prior to getting a literary agent, or I don't know, indie publishing. Might not actually be 4 books, but you have to actually write crappy manuscripts before you actually write good ones. And I think every writer starts out their journey with ambition, usually to tell a story and have it shared with the world. And so you have a vision of this perfect story in your head, but you lack the ability to tell it due to your lack of experience. So in addition, how you write a novel or how you operate as the author is something that no one can teach you. It's something that you have to learn for yourself. And you can watch videos like these, learn about how, what things make up a good story or how other writers write books, but no one can tell you how you write your books. Therefore, there's going to be a time in every writer's journey where you have more ambition than experience. You have to write many books before the quality of your work catches up with the ambition that led you to start this journey.
Something we also talked about in the other collab is that our weaknesses are most apparent in the first draft. And so that's also going to translate into the first book, because it all relates back to just that awareness of ourselves that I talked about, and how in the beginning, basically less experience equals less awareness. And so it's just a really, really common issue with first books, just to not see everything that's wrong with them.
Point number 6 is the characters or the world need to be fleshed out. There's a gap between the perfect story that's in our head and what you're able to translate onto the page. And the translation is never going to be as perfect as what's in your head, but you're able to better communicate that story through many rounds of revisions. So in first books, you might not be as experienced to make like 3-dimensional characters or characters with agency. And again, we talked about that in the previous video, so I'm not going to repeat too much there. Or maybe you're not yet really good at creating a full immersive world if you're writing like science fiction or fantasy. So carefully consider the needs, wants, and desires of the characters, what drives them to make their decisions, and those decisions should then in turn impact the plot. Carefully consider how your world operates, what's the economy like, what's the political situation, how are essentials shared, like, I don't know, food and water and clothing. And when in doubt, read books by the greats in your age category and genre to see how those authors create fully realized worlds and characters.
Yes, I love that. And I'll follow up with the cool thing about this video is in our video on first drafts, we talked about basically just being okay with first draft sucking. But when it comes to your first book, you can take the time to edit it and to fix it up to the level that you are at now, if that makes any sense. Like if you have written it over months or years and you've grown as a writer, you can take that time to edit the things that Meg's talking about and figure out your weaknesses and figure out your strengths and kind of grow and add to your story. So even though the first book is still only at the level that you are at, you can bring it up to the new level where you are at, if that makes any sense. And then another thing we wanted to talk about is how, especially with the first book, you probably haven't found your writing voice yet, because that can take a long time to find. And I feel like I'm still finding it. And just with every book that you write, you're going to figure out your own unique style. And some of it's going to be intentional, and other things are going to come out of, I would say, probably out of growing in your strengths and fixing your weaknesses. I think it's really going to just take a lot of time to develop that writing voice. So when you have your first book, you might be actually almost imitating other writing voices, maybe imitating your favorite writers who you read. There's potential that you are still figuring out your exact voice, I guess is how I would say that.
Our next topic is the newer the writer, the more cliches and tropes. Now, most writers include glaring cliches and unoriginal tropes in their first books. It just happens. We all do it. And many writers aren't as well read in modern books by the time they start writing their first book. So therefore, with books like The Chronicles of Narnia on the brain, a lovely book, but one that was written in an entirely different time, writers may fall into cliched characters, scenarios, or plot devices. And it doesn't have to be Chronicles of Narnia, but I feel like everyone reads that in, like, I don't know, elementary school. And that's the one that a lot of people reference in their query letters as a comp title, but neither here nor there. As such, the books may not get picked up by an agent or go over well with readers if they have so many cliches and tropes in them. And tropes aren't inherently a bad thing. Cliches kind of are. They're two different things, but they're kind of used interchangeably. So let's talk about a few examples of cliched beginnings. Describing the landscape, a character waking up, a dream, a character getting ready, a character studying their appearance in the mirror, a character interacting with their family, a character interacting with their best friends, or maybe like the school bully. The protagonist's parents die or are killed. In the dystopian genre, it's usually like the day of like choosing jobs, getting selected for something, being paired with the love interest. It could be starting from the antagonist's perspective when they're on like a killing spree. And it could be an omniscient narrator who talks directly to the reader, or it could just simply be describing a character's backstory with no scene at all, and that is my personal least favorite.
So what's the difference then? Okay, I shouldn't ask this in this video, but I want to. I just am so curious, where do you think the line is between cliches and tropes, just out of curiosity? Because I know that some people like tropes and they're almost, depending on what it is, almost expected in certain genres.
It really depends, but I like to think of tropes as like the chosen one. It's a trope, and people do it still, and it can be done well if done in a unique way. Cliches are like, I often think more like line level or scene level things. So like describing a character waking up at the start of your book, or like white knuckles on the steering wheel. That to me is like a cliche because it's been done so many times before and it's really not unique. Whereas a trope is like a scenario that's like a kind of like a format that you can choose to use, but in a unique way. That's how I look at it anyways.
I like that. So basically, like, tropes have, there's big picture enough that you can put your own spin on it and your own unique flavor, versus cliches, there's no way to make it your own, it sounds like. It's just sort of a copy. Sorry guys, that was a tangent. I just needed to know. Then our next point was how we haven't maybe found our editing style yet, or we haven't found our writing friends yet. And so both of those things are going to influence your first book, because if you don't have that outside feedback and that ability to self-edit, I guess you could say, like if you don't have the awareness yet, or you don't have friends who have that awareness yet, it can really heavily impact your first book and basically leave it in first draft mode, so to speak. And so I think that's a huge thing that comes into play with first books. And then as we grow, we get to know other writing friends who become our CPs or our betas, and we learn to hire the best editor for us, the one that fits with our personalities, and we maybe learn how to do self-edits better. Your books are also going to grow.
Okay, our next topic is not knowing where to start the story, or not knowing the most engaging place to start. And there are many places that a writer can start their story. There's no right or wrong way. Most writers choose to start the story somewhere around the inciting incident, as that's the moment where everything kind of changes for the protagonist. I talked about this a bunch in the other video, but I think it's worth repeating. The inciting incident offers a journey or an opportunity to the protagonist, one that could help them change their situation and achieve a goal, because most protagonists have a goal at the start of their story. That's something that they don't have, or they want to achieve, or someone they want to be with, whether it's like romance or something. And the inciting incident prevents the protagonist from returning to their normal lives, and thus the story begins. Therefore, if you start the story far before the inciting incident, there's likely going to be a lot of downtime before we get to the main plot or have any conflict, and stories without conflict are boring. So if you start the book too soon, you run the risk of the book being boring. And if you start the book too late, the reader is often dropped into the middle of the action, and you run the risk of them being confused and therefore kind of disengaging from the story, because they're like, who is this character? If it's the middle of a battle, why is this battle going on? Who's fighting? What's going on? And just being confused in general.
Yeah, I agree. And then our next point is that sometimes you can kind of drown in self-doubt. I feel like this comes sometimes after the fact and can kind of impede writing the next book and continuing in your career. And it can really come from getting bad reviews a lot of times for people. And it could also come from, again, that fear, that imposter syndrome that we talked about in our other video a lot, but I think it's worth mentioning here as well. This first book, when you, again, become aware of everything that you dislike about it, it can give you that imposter syndrome and that not good enough feel that we talked about, that basically keeps you from moving forward in your career and continuing to grow. And essentially the only way that you can resolve that feeling of not being good enough and of not liking your work and the things that your weaknesses that you want to improve on, the only way you can improve on them is to keep trying. And so the self-doubt can actually stop you from moving forward in that and can keep you stagnant in one place instead of growing as an author.
Our next point is veteran authors are more aware of the market and what's selling. So when deciding what books to write next, veteran authors, so authors who have published in the past and know what readers are and are not eagerly picking up, they may think more critically on what book idea they're going to pursue. So let's have a quick discussion about writing to market versus chasing trends. Chasing trends is when you write a book because it's currently popular. The writer usually isn't passionate about that story or that genre, but they're writing it because they know it will sell and maybe could financially benefit them. Writing to market is when a writer strategically writes a story they're interested in writing while including elements they think the readers will be interested in. So we have an episode of Publishable coming up on this topic very soon, but a few elements you could include in your story if you're writing to market or writing with the market in mind include maybe certain themes or certain character types, and this could be anything from like a strong female protagonist to morally gray characters to including like vampires in your novel. It could be this setting, such as like a dystopian, which was really popular a few years ago when Hunger Games and Divergent had their heyday. It's really not as in favor now, but that is an example of something that could be really popular or for writing to market. Another thing could be types of relationships and romance. For example, I've heard that reverse harems, I don't know how to say it, but they were popular for a while, but they're kind of slowly trending out of favor. To recap, pick a genre that you love and you're interested in writing, niche down and pick a popular subgenre, again, if you're trying to write to market. Study any tropes, themes, and similarities between popular books and your chosen subgenre, write the book, and then release it.
I can definitely chime in on that one because I have written the sci-fi and the dystopian, and then I've written the fantasy. And I know the fantasy hasn't come out yet, so to most people it seems like I've just done sci-fi, but in my head I've gone really far into the fantasy land, and I have found such a difference in people's interest, just because fantasy just has such a bigger audience, and I wasn't aware of that when I first started out. And so I just feel like the interest for this new series has skyrocketed compared to what I used to have for my dystopian series. And like, I love writing both genres. So the best advice that I heard was keep it within what you love. Like, don't feel like you have to go and write something you don't love, but out of the things that you love to write, look at the one that people are also most excited about reading. And our last talking point is about if you've never published before, and there are things that you're just not going to be aware of in the publishing process until you go through it. I think, honestly, knowing which battles to fight, but also knowing what you even want out of publishing. And that applies to indie publishing and traditional publishing. I think you're coming into it fresh, brand new. You don't know what to expect. So I will let Meg talk a little bit about traditional publishing, but on the self-publishing side, I definitely think where you're spending your money and budgeting and figuring out the things that are important for your book, like spending money on a really quality cover, a really quality editor, and things like that. Finding beta readers is super crucial. Finding a good critique partner is super important. And just like learning what you need to create a quality book will really come into play and help you do better books in the future. But I will let you talk maybe, Meg, about the traditional publishing side.
Sure. For traditional publishing, I think most authors who start out don't know how to get a literary agent. So maybe that's the first step, and you're trying to learn how to query someone, what the submission process is like, what stuff do you have to have prepared, or like cliches and tropes, what things do literary agents hate to see in their inboxes. And then eventually, once you have an agent, then that agent likely will share information with you about the things that they are seeing from editors. What are editors interested in? What are they taking? What are they not taking? What's trending right now? Then the agents usually have a nice finger on the pulse, and you can do that yourself from places like Publishers Marketplace. They announce publishing deals shortly after they happen, and then it's usually a year and change before the book is actually published. So that's a way for writers who don't have an agent and kind of want to be traditionally published. You can kind of keep an eye on what's trending, which is kind of really important for when things, just subgenres or types of characters or whatever, kind of go in and out of favor.
That's awesome. And then I feel like a lot of this, it's fun to look at it from a perspective of your book's already out and you can commiserate and be like, yeah, I've grown since then. And it's also fun to look at it if you haven't published yet and be really aware of all the things that come into play, because you kind of have, what's the phrase? A leg up or something like that. I think it's a leg up on everybody else if you're aware. Just having the awareness and the ability to look at your first book and see, again, like those tropes, these cliches, the weaknesses that you might have, the standard weaknesses that people have in general, and figuring out how to make your book better and bring in feedback, like we talked about. All of these things, if you do them, ultimately it will make your first book better. And if you haven't done them and you've already published your first book, then you can use them going forward. So I guess that's all we have for you guys today. I just want to say thank you so much to Meg for joining me. This was so much fun. We had so many laughs. I really think that you guys are going to love the video that we did over on iWriterly's channel. So make sure you go check out the link in the description box below to go watch that and have fun laughing with us about first drafts in general. Meg, can you tell everybody where you hang out on the internet and where they can find you?
Sure. So obviously I'm over on YouTube at iWriterly. We post weekly videos about how to be a modern day author. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram most actively at Meg Latour for Twitter, and it's at Meg_Latour for Instagram.
Awesome. I'm so excited that you were able to do this with me, Meg. It's been so fun, and you guys should go follow her. She's amazing. And even though I don't traditionally publish, I have always, Meg, I'll just tell you because we're chatting, I've always enjoyed all your videos, and I love learning. So it's really cool to learn about all the options that are out there. And I think that your stuff is fabulous. So I would encourage you guys to go check out her videos. And
thank you. You're so sweet. And I love your content too.
I love that. It's so fun to just like see all the different options in the writing community. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video today, and I hope that you can commiserate with how first books sometimes aren't our best, our first pancake. Thank you again, guys, for watching. I hope you give this video a thumbs up, subscribe below, and ring the bell next to it in case you want to be notified next time I have a video. And again, go to the description box below to watch the other collab over on iWriterly's YouTube channel. I'll talk to you guys again soon. Hope you have a great day. Bye.